Still waiting, hoping, wishing for the Sony RX10 V? For birds and wildlife, it might just already be here, and it's called the Sony A6700. The Sony RX10 IV, according to almost anyone you want to ask, might just be the best super zoom bridge camera ever made. I used it for 5 of the 7 years of its life, and the RX10 III for close to 2 years before that. The compact form factor, the amazingly sharp Zeiss 24 to 600 mm equivalent zoom, the excellent 20 megapixel back-illuminated sensor made the RX10 IV an ideal camera for walk-around bird, wildlife, and nature photography, for point-and-shoot nature photography, and opened up this rewarding activity to thousands, more likely hundreds of thousands, of people. My own ebook on using the Sony RX10 IV for bird, wildlife, and nature photography has been downloaded many thousands of times, and the companion video on setting up the camera for point-and-shoot nature photography has been viewed almost 60,000 times since I published it 2 years ago. However, current rumor has it that production of the RX10 IV will cease this summer. Sony has limited manufacturing capacity, and they already make a lot of different ASPC and full-frame cameras, a whole line of video-oriented and vlogging cameras, and most of the sensors for the other major camera makers, not to mention sensors for phones, including the iPhone, and industrial instruments. And there is, according to the same rumors, no RX10 V in the works. Evidently, Sony feels that the RX line has had its day. Those of you who already own the RX10 IV may be wondering if you should buy another one while they're still available, and those who have not yet tried the camera may be wondering if now is the time before it's too late. And both groups, as well as many others, might be wondering if not the RX10 IV, then what? Owners might be eyeing the upgrade path. Those new to bird, wildlife, and nature photography, especially point-and-shoot nature photography, may be wondering what the alternatives are. And to be fair, the RX10 IV, good as it still is somewhat dated now. Sony added rudimentary eye-tracking autofocus for humans and animals, good for dogs and cats and not much else, through a firmware upgrade a few years ago. But the bird and wildlife, insect, human, airplane, train, motorsports, subject detection, and sophisticated eye-tracking autofocus built into the specialized AI chip in their latest full-frame and ASPC cameras is leagues beyond what the RX10 IV can do. Among the best in the industry, in fact. However, there's nothing on the market that compares directly with the RX10 IV. There is nothing that has the same quality and as compact and lightweight a form factor. Nothing that embraces the full range of nature photography, from landscape and macro to big game and small birds and smaller insects. Nothing even comes close to matching that range. Even if your photography is centered mostly on birds and wildlife and some macro, to get a Sony camera with all the new focus features, you are looking at the very least at the Sony A6700 ASPC body and a lens that reaches at least 600 mm equivalent and has decent macro capabilities. The lightest lens that more or less fits the bill is the Sony E 70 to 350 f4.5 to f6.3 G OSS zoom, 350 mm on the A67's ASPC crop sensor is 525 mm equivalent. However, if you compare pixel for pixel, taking into account that the RX10 IV has a 20 mm sensor and the A6700 has a 26 megapixel sensor, a 20 megapixel crop from the A6700 gives you an approximate equivalent of 682 millimeters, if I'm doing the math right. You would still sacrifice a stop and a half of light, f4 versus f6.3, but you might hope that the better low-light performance of the larger ASPC sensor would compensate for that somewhat. The A6700 and the 70 to 350 weigh 2.5 pounds, compared to the 2.4 pounds of the RX10 IV, so the weight is about the same. But the A6700 and zoom are still slightly bigger than the RX10 IV, especially when the zoom extended. Still manageable, but bigger. Cost-wise, the RX10 IV is still going for around $1,700, $1,200 on the used market, though if you remember, some of us paid close to $2,000 when it first came out, while the a6700 and 70-350 would set you back around $2,300, perhaps less on sale, and you might save a few hundred by going used. The other lens you might consider is the Tamron 50-400 Di3 VC VXD zoom, a full-frame lens, so bigger and heavier, but with the added reach at both ends, 75mm equivalent versus 105, 600 equivalent versus 525. And if we do the same thing with the 20mm crop on the a6700, you have a reach of approximately 780 millimeters compared to the 600 millimeters on the RX10 IV. The speed of the Tamron and Sony zoom lenses is identical, both 4.5 to 6.3. Both have image stabilization, OSS on the Sony and VC on the Tamron. The Tamron is weather sealed, the Sony is moisture and dust resistant, whatever that means. The Tamron has a somewhat closer focus distance, providing near macro at 75 millimeters through about 110 millimeter equivalent at 1 to 2, and 1 to 4 at 600 millimeters from 1.5 meters. Some of the comparison tests I could find indicate that the Tamron is somewhat sharper and has better micro contrast at all focal lengths, though the 70-350 is rated as very sharp all across the range in non-comparison tests. Then, too, the Tamron is a full-frame lens, so you're already cutting off the edges, where performance sometimes degrades. An a6700 and Tamron zoom weigh in at 3.5 pounds, a pound more than the a6700 and the 70-350 or the RX10 IV, but the combination is at least twice as large as the RX10 IV, especially with the zoom extended to 600 millimeter equivalent. Again, still manageable for most of us, but nowhere near as handy as the RX10 IV. Total cost would be closer to $2,600, depending on what sales are on at the time. I went with the Tamron 50-400 Di3. To me, the extra weight and size are fully compensated for by the weather sealing, the greater reach at both ends, and especially the macro capabilities. I bought a cotton carrier to carry the rig in the field, and I'm happy with it. I will admit that if I had come to the a6700 and Tamron directly from the Sony RX10 IV, the weight difference might have been a deal-breaker. But I spent 2 years trying and failing to learn to love the OM System OM1 and their 100-400 IS zoom, which is almost exactly the same size and weight. But then, how does actual performance compare when photographing birds, wildlife, and nature? The RX10 IV versus the a6700 with the Tamron 50-400. First, let's talk about the obvious. The focus on the RX10 IV is fast and accurate, and if you use expandable movable spot and can manage to get the spot on your subject, it works very well even in challenging situations like birds buried in foliage or brush or a distant elk against the opposing slope. However, the subject detecting eye-tracking AI-powered autofocus on the a6700 is simply magic. It is so much easier to shoot everything from birds in brush to dragonflies on grass stalks to rutting elk to least terns doing their aerial acrobatics. The camera finds your subject, locks on the eye if possible, and stays focused on the eye, even if it is moving in the frame, even if it is momentarily turned away. If it can't find the eye, it focuses on the head. If it can't find the head, it focuses on the body. If it can't identify a subject at all, it reverts to normal focus, tracking or not, depending on your settings, and still gets the shot 90% of the time. Birds in flight, no problem. Dragonflies in flight, yes, it can. Bear, elk, deer, fox, wolf, monkey, lion, good to go. It's really a bird, wildlife, and nature photographer's dream. It might not do anything the RX10 IV could not do if you took enough shots, but it does it quicker, more often, and more reliably than the RX10 IV ever did. This is based on my experience with the Tamron 50-400, but I have no reason to think that the focus on the Sony 70-350 would not be just as good, if not better. In a difficult situation, where you might have come away with one good shot out of 30 that you took with the RX10 IV, with the a6700, you would come out of the same situation with at least 15 shots out of 30 being perfectly focused. And that's a conservative estimation. In most situations, they would all be in focus. And in situations where there's only time for a few shots, like 5 frames and the bird or beast is gone, the a6700 will get the eye-sharp shot almost every time, where the RX10 IV would often fail. It's not even a fair comparison. The a6700 is just that much better. The a6700 also has a slight edge in image quality, as you would expect from the larger and considerably newer sensor. And yet, the a67 and Tamron lens provides the same rich, deep, three-dimensional rendering that we all love in the RX10 IV with its Zeiss lens. Just less noise, more highlight and shadow detail, and slightly truer colors. In addition, for those of us who practice point-and-shoot nature photography and do not shoot in RAW, the a6700 offers HEIF as an option, with files half the size of JPEG, and 10-bit encoding for improved color, detail, and dynamic range. Some will not be able to use the HEIF format due to limitations of their hardware or software, but for Apple users in particular, it's totally easy, and does, I think, produce files that have more potential in editing. As far as low-light performance goes, the a6700 and Tamron lens makes up for its stop-and-a-half slower aperture with much improved high ISO noise performance. The RX10 IV's f4 lens manages ISO 10,000 in the same light that requires 12,800 from the a6700 and Tamron f6.3. But the a6700 images show less noise and truer colors even so. At the same ISO, 12,800, the a6700 is the clear winner. Of course, putting images from the two cameras through any modern noise reduction produces images that are just fine for almost any use, though you can still see a small but noticeable advantage to the a6700's larger sensor. Lens to lens, Zeiss to Tamron, on feathers and fur? Well, you can't really test IQ independent of the sensors, especially since the RX10 IV lens is permanently tied to its 1-inch sensor. As I said above, the way the Tamron renders detail and color reminds me a lot of the way the Zeiss on the RX10 does, and that's a very good thing. Comparison shots, as distance to subject increases, show just slightly more detail and finer detail with the a6700 and Tamron than the RX10 IV is capable of. But the Zeiss-designed lens on the RX10 IV and the smaller sensor hold up very well. It's really difficult to find differences, and they would certainly not be visible in normal viewing. And since the Zeiss 24-600 is one of the finest zooms I've ever used, that's saying quite a lot for the Tamron. Finally, let's talk about handling in the field, maybe the elephant in the room, since what many of us love most about the RX10 IV is the fact that it is so easy to carry and use. The a6700 with either lens I've mentioned is just going to be bigger and heavier and require a different approach in the field. You could sling the RX10 IV on a strap over your shoulder or hanging at your hip and hike all day. I would not try that with the a6700 and either lens, though the 70-350 might just do. I need a cotton carrier chest harness to carry the weight of the camera and the Tamron lens while walking any distance, and to get the weight out of my hands and off my wrist every once in a while for a rest. On the other hand, when actually taking photos, the a6700 and telephoto zoom is not that much harder to handle than the RX10 IV, and easier in some ways. I generally carried a monopod with a beanbag head to support the RX10 IV while shooting. I felt that I needed it for stability, even with the image stabilization in the RX10 IV engaged. I do not generally carry the monopod when using the a6700 and the Tamron, shooting handheld and offhand. Then, too, the controls on the a6700, inherited mostly from the full-frame Sony cameras, have been refined to the point where I never have to use the function button when working in the field. Every change I need to make on the fly, I've been able to program to a custom button on the body, or in one case on the lens, so I can make almost all changes needed without taking the camera away from my eye. There are little touches that make the whole operation easier and more intuitive. For instance, for things that you have to change often, like the focus area or the subject detection, from animal, bird to insect for instance, you are able to restrict your choices to those you actually use, so that a press of a button cycles you through only your choices, quickly, until you come to the one you need. And because of the way subject detection and focus area selections are made, with the a6700, instead of having separate memory programs, one for birds, one for wildlife, one for birds in flight, one for landscapes and general subjects, etc., I can have one custom memory for more or less stationary birds, wildlife, and insects, and one custom memory for action in flight, birds, wildlife, or insects, which leaves me with a custom memory to devote to macro. All in all, the way the a6700 works in the field is simply a very useful refinement of the way the RX10 IV works. I could go back to the RX10 IV, but I would miss the handling of the a6700. Finally, if you turn on full-time direct manual focus, the focus ring on both lenses is ideally placed to quickly bring the lens close to focus so the camera can find your bird or bug or beast. Very handy. There are, of course, other options out of the Sony universe. The OM Systems OM1 or OM1 Mark II with the M-Zyco 100-400 f5 to f6.3 zoom weighs about the same and is about the same size as the a6700 with the Tamron zoom and costs just over $3,000 or under if you opt for the older OM1 while stocks last. As I mentioned, I also own this combination and have used it for almost 2 years. The OM1 is a top-of-the-line camera with a fast stacked sensor, high frame rates, and an array of computational photography features only equaled by the most expensive and newest full-frame cameras from other makers. The 100-400, on the other hand, is an adapted full-frame zoom made for OM systems by Sigma. It's not as sharp or as contrasty as the Tamron zoom. The sensor and lens combination produces sharp images, especially at under 30 feet, but without a lot of depth or dimensionality. And as distances increase, the a6700 and Tamron show a clear edge in feather and fur detail. My feeling is that to really get the performance out of the OM1 that it is capable of, you need to invest in the much more expensive prime or zoom lenses. The 300 f4 Pro Prime, $3,000, or the M-Zyco 150-400 f4.5 IS with built-in 1.25 extender, $7,500. The new 150-600, also a tweaked Sigma full-frame lens, is only a slight improvement over the 100-400, and it still costs $2,700. I can get both the a6700 and the Tamron zoom for the cost of either of the two less expensive OM lenses, and a decent full-frame body and long zoom for the price of the 150-400 Pro. The other option might be the Canon R7 and their RT 100-400 IS zoom. I've not tried this combo, but it is the lightest, though not the smallest option, and can be had for right around $2,000. The R7 has reported focus issues, and the 100-400 is not weather-sealed in any way, and might not be the sharpest lens on the block, but is still an option. As with the OM system, most of the upgrade lenses are much more expensive and much bigger and heavier than the 100-400. So, can anything replace the RX10 IV for point-and-shoot nature photography, especially for bird and wildlife photography? The Sony a6700 with the E70-350 G OSS lens might come very close, offering considerably better autofocus, slightly better image quality, and noticeably better handling at the price of an added tenth of a pound and, technically, a bit less reach. But if you want a true upgrade from the RX10 IV and are willing to carry a pound more, then I highly recommend the Sony a6700 with the Tamron 50-400 f4.5 to 6.3 Di 3 VC VXD zoom. By the way, There are a lot more menu options that have to be dealt with to set up the a6700 for point-and-shoot nature photography than there were on the RX10 IV. But not to worry, of course, I've already written the booklet really, and produced a companion video. See the link below. So really, if you shoot mostly birds and wildlife with some macro, the RX10 V we've all been waiting for has been here for a while. They just call it the a6700